Tonight's presentation is titled, Is Hangaring Worth It? Our presenter is Mike Busch. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, holds a certified flight instructor certificate and also an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization privileges, and the Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008, honored by the FAA, and a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, everybody. We're going to be talking about, is hangaring worth it? I'm not going to be able to answer the question. I just would like to start a conversation on the subject. I bought my current airplane, which is a Cessna 310. I bought it in 1987. There's what I looked like in 1987. There's what the plane looked like. 3 years later, I gave it a new paint job, and it started looking like what it currently looks like. I based the airplane at Santa Maria Public Airport in California. When I first bought the airplane, this was by far the most complicated and expensive airplane I'd ever owned. I'd owned two previous airplanes, both single-engine airplanes. Cessna 182 was my first airplane. A Belanca Super Viking was my second. When I bought the 310, which was kind of a big step up in complexity and cost and maintenance and so on, I decided that that it was real important that I be able to keep it in the hangar. And at first, I kept it in a big community hangar with a whole bunch of other airplanes that it was a little bit inconvenient. I was worried about hangar rash. It was a little bit hard to work on my airplane in the community hangar, although I did it. And like a lot of airports at Santa Maria, if you want to sign up for your own hangar, you get on a waiting list and you sort of have to wait for somebody to die or something. But 10 years later, I finally got to the head of the waiting list, and I was able to lease my own hangar. It's a beautiful big 60 by 40 foot clear span hangar with plenty of room for my airplane and my toolbox and my workbench and my couch and my refrigerator. And in fact, a few times we've had two airplanes in there. So it's a nice, generous size hangar. And I've kept the airplane in there now for 20 some odd years. I've owned the airplane for, I guess it's 32 years now. And then a funny thing happened. I was up at AirVenture this year, and I got home early in August, and I went through a big stack of accumulated mail, and there, buried in the stack of accumulated mail, was a letter from Santa Maria Airport to announce something called the Taxi Lane Rehabilitation Project. I didn't know what a taxi lane was. Never heard that term before. But it turns out that the taxi lanes are the little paved strips that separate rows of hangars. And this elaborate announcement said that they had gotten a bunch of funding, and they were going to be tearing up and improving, rehabilitating the taxi lanes. Now, I didn't see anything wrong with the taxi lanes the way they were, and I wasn't sure why they were doing this, but nobody asked me. I just was informed that they were going to be doing this taxi lane rehabilitation project. And the net result was that I would be locked out of my hangar for 3 weeks. Well, I would either be locked into my hangar or out of my hangar. But they said, basically, if the airplane's in the hangar when this starts, you're not going to be able to get it out. And if it's out of the hangar, you're not going to be able to get it in. So a number of my colleagues at the airport decided to let their planes get locked in. I had some trips that I needed to take during that 3 weeks. I couldn't afford to leave it locked in. So I was going to have to get it out of there and figure out someplace to park it for the 3 weeks until the construction project was done and I got back in my hangar. This is the part of the airport where most of the hangars are located, and you can see there's a whole bunch of rows of hangars, and my hangar was right there, and so I was going to have to move it, and pretty much the only place that I could move it was a tie down area that we used to call a boneyard. It basically contained a bunch of derelict airplanes that had major parts missing, so they couldn't go anywhere. But I was going to have to move my airplane out of the hangar and into the boneyard area. So shortly before the construction started, I did that. And here's what it looked like sitting out in the boneyard area. I scoped this place out pretty carefully to figure out where I wanted to park my airplane so that it was near someplace that I could park the car and so on. But this would be the first time that the airplane was going to sit outside for any significant period of time since I first had bought it 32 years prior. And so it started reacquainting me with some of the issues involved in storing an airplane outdoors. And it started to give me a newfound appreciation for just how valuable it is to have a hangar. The first thing that came to mind when I put the airplane out on the tie down was I was going to have to lock it up. Now, I never lock my airplane in the hangar because the hangar's locked, so I never worry about it. But I was going to have to lock up the airplane. Of course, locking up a Cessna is sort of a bit of a joke because the Cessna locks are sort of notorious that they only keep the honest people out. They're pretty easy to break into. We've had to break into a couple of Cessnas where the owner lost the key, and it's extremely easy to do. On single engine Cessna, all you have to do is rock the wings nice and vigorously, and you can usually get a door open. On the twins, it's a little bit harder, but the locks aren't exactly burglar proof. But the thing about my Cessna 310 is there's an awful lot of things to lock. It turns out that there's 5 different lockable doors on the airplane. There's the main cabin door, there's the baggage door, there's 2 wing locker doors, and then there's a big nose baggage compartment door. So locking up the airplane involves going around the airplane and locking up 5 different locks. And in the process, I discovered that the lock on the nose baggage compartment wasn't working. I hadn't noticed that before because I never lock it, but I wound up having to do a little field maintenance on it to get it so where it would lock properly. I considered doing some other things. Considered the possibility of putting in cowl plugs, window covers, and so on. We'll talk a little bit about that later. I decided for the 3 weeks that I wasn't going to do that. I did put a pitot cover on the airplane while it was outside. And then one of the things that occurred to me when I parked it out in this spot in the boneyard that was near where I could park my car is when I took the airplane on a trip, like I had a trip to San Diego coming up really pretty quickly after this displacement happened. How was I sure that somebody else wasn't going to take my prime spot while I was gone? So I came up with a scheme of putting some traffic cones around my airplane. Wasn't sure how the airport was going to feel about that, but I thought maybe if I put the traffic cones out, it might discourage somebody from taking the parking place that I had decided to appropriate for the duration of this 3-week exile. And it turns out that there was some inexpensive collapsible traffic cones available on Amazon that collapse flat. You can stick them in the baggage compartment. They don't take up very much room, and then you expand them when you want to put them out on the tarmac, and that worked pretty well. And so I had several trips during the 3-week period, and nobody took my spot while I was gone, and nobody said anything about me putting out the traffic cones. But at any rate, I kind of had a hankering for my hangar, and it started me thinking about what all of the benefits of hangaring the aircraft, something that I hadn't really given a lot of thought to, because I had just sort of taken the hangar for granted for such a long time. Now, of course, sometimes hangaring isn't a viable option, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But if a hangar is available, I guess the question is it worth it? It's clearly expensive, a lot more expensive than tying the airplane down. But what are the benefits of hangaring, and do the benefits outweigh the costs, or the other way around? Everybody has to answer that question for themselves. I'll just talk a little bit about my own thought process as I was going through this little 3-week eviction. I've heard a lot of people, when the subject comes up, I've heard a lot of aircraft owners make statements along the following lines: it's cheaper for me to repaint my airplane every 5 years than to hangar it. And that may be true, but I think it misses the point. The preservation of the aircraft's exterior is pretty far down on my list of reasons for wanting to hangar the airplane. It certainly does allow you to keep the paint job in better shape and repaint the airplane less often, but that's really not the main reason for hangaring an airplane. In my view, probably the number one benefit, the number one reason, is to prevent corrosion, both corrosion of the engine and corrosion of the airframe, especially if the airframe is if it's an all-metal airplane like mine is. And to prevent corrosion, you have to keep the airplane dry. Corrosion can occur in the absence of moisture. And I'm not just talking about keeping it dry, keeping it out of the rain. We don't really get very much rain in California. We're in the middle of our rainy season right now, as it happens, but typically we only get rain 4 months out of the year, and 8 months out of the year it doesn't rain at all here. So rain is really not the main concern when I'm talking about keeping the airplane dry. It's really condensation, and condensation is something that happens all year round. If you think for a moment of what happens when you park a car, and imagine that you one night you park a car in your garage, and the next night you leave the car out on the driveway. And when you come back in the morning, typically, if the car was parked in the driveway, it's all covered with dew in the morning. And if it was parked in the garage, the windows are nice and clear. And now it's not because it's any drier inside the garage than it is outside. It isn't. Unless you have a dehumidifier running in your garage or something, which most of us don't. The humidity is exactly the same inside the garage as outside the garage. What's different, and the reason that the garage has this effect on you, is because the temperature outside goes through this diurnal temperature variation, where it warms up during the day and cools down at night. Inside the garage, the temperature variation is much less than what the temperature variation is outside. And it's that diurnal temperature cycle that drives the condensation cycle and causes moisture in the air to condense out as visible moisture. Also, if the car is left out on the driveway, the cycling temperature inside the car is aggravated by greenhouse effect, by the fact that sun comes in the windows and heats up the interior of the car much hotter than it would be, say, if the windows were open. And in the case of an airplane that sits outside, this very profound temperature cycling inside is going to affect avionics and other expensive things that are in the interior of the aircraft. So to me, that the number one reason for hangaring an airplane is to minimize corrosion and other environmental sorts of things. An airplane that sits outside, pretty much everything that's made of rubber or plastic is going to deteriorate more rapidly than it is if it's hangared. But the big, really high ticket thing is corrosion, both corrosion in the engine, where we worry about things like cam and lifter spalling and things that are affected by corrosion, and the airframe, especially if it's an all-metal airplane. Probably the second most important thing to me about having an airplane in a hangar is if you are somebody who likes to work on your airplane, which obviously I do, and I think a lot of you do. It's inside a hangar is a much more friendly environment to work on the airplane. You've got your toolbox there, you've got power there, you've got everything you need to work. You're shielded from the wind and any rain and anything like that. You always can work on the airplane. And if you're working on the airplane, you have it all apart and you decide you want to quit for the day or you want to go home for lunch, you can, leave the cowls on the hangar floor and not worry about them disappearing while you're gone or blowing away or anything like that. It's just a much more friendly environment for somebody who wants to work on an airplane. And I've done a fair amount of battlefield work outdoors when, for example, airplane breaks while you're on a trip someplace. And I've, changed vacuum pumps and disassembled magnetos and stuff on my airplane outside while I was away from home. And it's definitely no fun to do that. It's much nicer to have a hangar. A couple of other things. With the 3 weeks that the airplane was out of doors, I worried about vandals and gawkers and stuff that I never worry about when the airplane's locked up in a hangar. It just seemed so exposed. And then there are things like our feathered friends that like to leave presents on airplanes that are parked outdoors. There's concerns about bird's nests, another nice thing our feathered friends do that we don't worry about when the airplane is in the hangar. There's just a lot of stuff. Fortunately, living in California, I don't have to worry about this stuff, but in a lot of parts of the country, not right now, that this is a concern for airplanes that sit outside. And I have had occasion when I was on trips to the cold country where I would come out to the airplane and it was all iced up, and flying it became very problematic because it was all covered with ice and snow, and how you get it off is really quite a pain. When the airplane's in a hangar, you never have to worry about this. So, bottom line, after 3 weeks of being thrown out of my hangar, I certainly decided that it was definitely worth the money that I was spending to keep it inside. Obviously, your mileage may vary on this. Everybody has to make this trade-off. But for me, this 3 weeks of being thrown out of my hangar made it very obvious to me that at least for me, spending the money to hangar the airplane was well worth it. Incidentally, I still have a request out to the airport office for some sort of a rent rebate for the period that I was tossed out of my hangar. And the airport manager says he's working on it, but I haven't seen any rebate yet. So we'll see how that comes out. That's that hasn't been resolved yet. I got a couple of emails from people knowing that this I was going to be doing this webinar tonight that asked me to talk a little bit about if you can't hang your airplane, what do I think the most important steps would be to protect it. Seems to me probably the most important thing if it's if the airplane's going to be stored out of doors is putting in cowl plugs. They're cheap, they're easy to install and remove, they're not much of a hassle, and they help minimize corrosion in the engine compartment, and they minimize the possibility that birds' nests and stuff are going to wind up there. So that one's pretty easy. Internal reflective window covers, the kind that mount inside the airplane and are made out of a reflective insulating material. Also, they're not that much of a hassle to install and remove. They stow pretty compactly, so you can carry around with you, and they help eliminate this greenhouse effect thing and keep the temperatures inside the cabin when the sun is out to reasonable levels. So the upholstery and the plastic and the avionics and stuff don't get baked nearly as much as they do if you don't put window covers on. I actually have a set of the window covers for the 310 that I carry around with me, and especially if I'm flying to some place that gets hot during the day, I will typically install them. The 310 has an awful lot of windows, so it takes a little while to install the covers, but I think it's worth it. External window covers are another matter. I'm not really a big fan of those. I think that they're a mixed blessing. The problem with external window covers is twofold. They get waterlogged if it rains, and they don't dry out real fast. But probably the most serious problem is that if it's windy out, dirt and dust can get lodged up underneath the cover and scratch the windows, scratch the plexiglass. And I've seen a lot of windows, airplane windows that were kind of ruined by the use of covers like this. So I'm not really that big a fan of external covers. I think the internal ones are very helpful in keeping cockpit temperatures down. The external ones are really designed to protect the windows, and sometimes they do, but there are various conditions in which they can do more harm than good. So I consider them a mixed blessing. Engine covers like this can be useful for airplanes that are in frigid climates. But basically an engine cover like this, its main claim to fame is it keeps the heat in. So, you know, if you had an electric engine heater like a Tannis or something running, or even a 100-watt light bulb stuck up the cowl flap, a cover like this would keep the heat in and keep the engine at a nice constant temperature. Or if you're landing and making a quick turn, you're only going to be on the ground for an hour or something, and it's cold out, putting a cover like this in can retain engine heat. But in terms of, long-term parking out on a tie down, a cover like this isn't going to really help keep in engine heat unless there's some source of heat. And most of the time, airplanes out on tie downs don't have a handy set source of heat because they don't have access to an electrical outlet or anything like that. So it's really kind of situational as to whether an engine cover like this is going to be helpful or not. Obviously, in California, where I live, there's not much cause for this kind of thing. But I used to do a lot of flying to the cold country. I used to be the part owner of a business up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I would fly up there quite frequently. So I've had quite a bit of experience taking my airplane to cold places. But to me, when I go to cold places, it's worth spending the money to put the airplane in a heated hangar, at least overnight, the night before I'm ready to depart. So everything gets preheated that way. And Tim, that's about all I have on the subject of hangaring, but we can open it up for some Q&A if you'd like to.
Okie dokie, Mike. Let's get in with Richard's question here. First, he's wondering, I cover and plug my airplane every time I need to park it outside. What was your thought process on not covering or plugging your 310?
It was just a trade-off because I've hangared the airplane for so long. I didn't own a set of cowl plugs and so on, and I just questioned whether it would be worth ordering them just for this 3-week period of time. It was, you know, there would have been a good argument for doing so, and if I had cowl plugs, I certainly would have used them. I just didn't have any because the airplane's been hangared for the last 30 years and I haven't had to think about it. But had I had the cowl plugs, for sure I would have used them. I think that for sure is the single easiest and most effective thing that you can do to help things. I did have a pitot cover, so I did install that while the airplane was outdoors, and I did have the interior window covers, which I put up, but I didn't have cowl plugs, and I just made a decision not to order them just for the 3-week period.
David's wondering, do you advise closing cowl flaps if you park outside?
I'm not sure what effect that would have. I mean, normally cowl flaps, when they close, don't close all the way. So it's not like closing cowl flaps would prevent something from getting in. I don't think closing cowl flaps makes a big difference, but certainly plugging up the inlets would make a big difference. If your airplane has cowl flaps that effectively close all the way, then it probably would be worth closing them. But I've never seen cowl flaps that did that. Normally they restrict the opening on the bottom of the cowling, but they don't restrict it down small enough that nothing could get in. So
Mark's wondering, would you use rudder gust lock, aileron, or flap gust locks?
Oh, if it was windy out, for sure. And I always carry those in the airplane as well. And anytime that it sounds like it's going to be windy, I always do install the external locks on my rudder and on my ailerons. The rudder on the 310 is particularly vulnerable because it's a very, very large rudder surface. Twin engine airplanes typically have very large rudders because they have to be able to counteract asymmetric thrust if an engine fails, and that makes the rudders pretty vulnerable in a strong wind. So in this particular case, I didn't actually have occasion to use it during the 3 weeks because the weather was pretty benign during that particular 3 weeks. If the airplane was outside now, we're having quite a few storms come through. Definitely, without question, external locks would have gone on.
Dale's wondering, when you travel, do you hangar your plane at the FBO?
Most of the time I don't, unless it depends, but the majority of the time I don't. The majority of the time I leave it outside. If it's a cold weather situation, I will normally arrange to have the airplane brought into the hangar the night before my departure, in order to get everything nicely preheated for my departure. But normally when I'm traveling, I will leave the airplane outside. But on the other hand, when I'm traveling, it usually doesn't sit outside for 3 weeks because I'm not normally in any one spot for that long. And as I said, I do carry window covers. I do carry a pitot cover. I do use forgot what I was going to say, but cowl plugs are probably something I ought to add to my arsenal. Oh, I do use external gust locks, but cowl plugs are something I just haven't don't have. Probably ought to have. Probably would not be a bad idea.
Couple critter questions here. First one, please discuss best suggestions to keep mice out, hangared or on the ramp.
Mice are terrible. I've seen so much rodent damage in airplanes. I've seen rodent damage in automobiles too, and it's very, very hard to keep them out. The way that I know of to keep them out is to put some sort of a cover, like a box type cover over the landing gear, so that to make it hard for them to climb on them, and to put something on the tie down ropes, something like a paper plate with a slit in it, slid over the tie down ropes, will act as an effective block that will prevent the mice from climbing up the tie down ropes. But you have to prevent them from getting in. Wherever the airplane actually touches the ground is where you have to put up defenses. I know with my cars, I've experimented with things like these ultrasonic devices that are supposed to make sounds that make the mice unhappy and go away, and they've never seemed to work very well for me. Rodents are a real problem. And they're difficult to deal with.
Chris says that he parked his airplane outside for a while and it ended up full of bees. And is it okay to apply pesticide to the aircraft as a preventive measure?
Oh boy, I do not know the answer to that. I don't know enough about pesticides to know whether they're corrosive to aluminum or anything or not. That's not a problem I've ever run into, but that sounds like a problem I don't ever want to run into.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, Mike says over the years he's had issues with mud daubers, birds, mice, and snakes. All come for the mice. And I know mud daubers is a big one, isn't it?
Yeah. Mud daubers they like to get into pitot tubes. They like to get into tank vents and things like that. Any small diameter hole that they can nest in.
So you just got to cover it to keep them out, right? That's all you can do.
Yeah, I don't think we have mud daubers here in California, but I know when I was back east, they were a big problem.
Sure, we got them in the Midwest. Randy's wondering, is an open-sided shed worth it?
Yeah, what do they call those things? But yeah,
like a lean-to, or kind of like a carport, airplane port.
Yeah. They have a lot of those. I know, like when I'm in Las Vegas, there's a limited number of full hangars, but there are a lot of these shade kind of things that are, like you say, kind of carports for airplanes. And I think they are very worthwhile. Again, they aren't as effective as a hangar, but they will keep the diurnal temperature variation that will help minimize it by keeping the airplane in the shade all the time. And again, if you just think about, does parking a car in a carport help keep the windows from fogging up at night? And the answer is it does. It's not as effective as a closed garage, but it certainly is more effective than leaving the vehicle outside. And that condensation that you can see so clearly on a car is happening all inside the structure of an airplane, and that's really where the corrosion concern comes from.
Tobin is wondering, will frequent waxing help mitigate ill effects of the condensation?
No, the ill effects of the condensation are really inside where you can't get to. The thing that will help mitigate it, and I meant to include it on one of the slides and I totally forgot, so thank you for triggering this thought, is if the airplane is parked outside and it's a metal airplane, it is a very good idea to do fairly frequent applications of anti-corrosive compounds like ACF 50 or Corrosion X, these things that you fog inside the airframe, and they create a barrier layer all over everything in places where you couldn't get in to get paint or anything in there. But these corrosion control compounds, of which there are a number of different kinds, are very helpful. I'm a fan of the thin film dielectric type compounds, which are the most popular, are Corrosion X and ACF 50. And if the airplane is stored outside, that probably ought to be applied inside the airplane every year or 2 years, probably. Usually you do it at annual when the airplane's opened up and all the inspection plates are open, because that gives you the access you need to fog that stuff in. But that's probably the best defense against airframe corrosion that's available, other than putting the airplane in the hangar. Doesn't help with engine corrosion. We don't have a good way to protect the inside of an engine, but the inside of an airframe we can protect with those kind of compounds.
James and John are both wondering about anything special to do when you're tied down outside near a coastline with saltwater.
Yeah, it just makes everything much worse. And that's a situation I deal with. I'm 8 miles from the Pacific Ocean, and when the airplane was sitting outdoors, if I would go up to the airplane in the morning and run my finger along the leading edge of a propeller blade and then stick it in my mouth, I could taste salt. So there's definitely salt in the air, and that aggravates the corrosion problem tremendously, because what triggers corrosion is dissimilar metals, which the airplane is full of, coming in contact with a conductive liquid called an electrolyte. And the electrolyte is typically water with some sort of impurity in it that causes the water to become conductive. And the most common impurity that does that is salt. And that's why when you're near the coast, the corrosion problem is greatly magnified, because there's enough salt floating around in the air that the moisture that condenses is not pure unadulterated water, which doesn't conduct electricity. Distilled water doesn't conduct electricity, but it's water with just enough salt in it that it turns it into a pretty effective electrolyte and allows the corrosion to take place.
Chris is wondering, are these corrosion compounds necessary if the interior of the aircraft is zinc chromated?
They're not as necessary if the interior is zinc chromated. But the question is was zinc chromate applied to everything? The most vulnerable areas of metal airplanes, as far as corrosion is concerned, are typically the edges of sheets and holes that are drilled through sheets, like rivet holes and so on. Most metal airplanes are made of alclad aluminum sheet, typically 2024 T3 alclad. The 2024 is an aluminum alloy that where the aluminum has a significant amount of copper alloyed to it. That gives the dissimilar metals that are required for corrosion. So 2024 is very vulnerable to corrosion. But you have to alloy the aluminum in order to give it any strength. Commercially pure aluminum is very, very soft, and it doesn't have any structural integrity to speak of. So the material that most metal airplanes are made of is this stuff called 2024 T3 Alclad, where they take a sheet of 2024 aluminum alloy and they apply a very thin layer of commercially pure aluminum, a couple of thousandths of an inch thick on each side. And aluminum, commercially pure aluminum, is a very, very good corrosion barrier. So it protects the sheet from corrosion, even though what it's mostly made out of is very vulnerable to corrosion, but it's got this cladding over, this pure aluminum cladding. The place where that breaks down is at the edges of the sheets. Any place that the aluminum sheet is cut obviously exposes the 2024 alloy, and any place it's drilled exposes it. So that's really typically where most corrosion damage starts, is on the edges and on the inside the holes where the cladding has been breached. So getting back to the original question about the
zinc
chromate primer, it sort of depends on how that primer was applied. If the primer was applied after the airplane was put together, the likelihood of it getting into the holes and so on is not very great, and there's still going to be a vulnerability there. On the other hand, if it was made the way, for example, Cessna now makes their airplanes in Independence, where every sheet is dunked in a tank of primer. It's actually not zinc chromate. It's an epoxy primer. It's better than zinc chromate. And it's completely and totally primed with that stuff before anything gets riveted together. Then the protection is much more complete. But if it was chromated after the stuff was riveted together, then there's still going to be places that are vulnerable. And the beauty of the thin film dielectric compounds like ACF 50 and Corrosion X is that stuff is very effective at getting in everywhere. And in fact, that's why after an application of that stuff, the airplane tends to weep excess compound for a period of weeks afterwards, because that stuff is just very, very good at flowing into all of the nooks and crannies where corrosion could develop.
Chris is wondering, my aircraft was treated with LPS3 a number of years ago. Is it a problem now to retreat with ACF 50 or Corrosion X?
No, it's not a problem. And the LPS3 probably is mostly long gone. LPS3 is a different sort of a corrosion preventative that leaves sort of a waxy film. It's a paraffin in a light hydrocarbon carrier fluid, and you spray it on, and the hydrocarbon evaporates and just leaves a layer of the waxy, just kind of a waxy layer that serves as a barrier, kind of like the same way paint does. The thin film dielectric work differently. They aren't really barrier type things. They actually are man-made molecules that have one end that has a very high affinity for metal, and the other end which has a very high affinity for water. And so it's a chemical that's designed to get in between the metal and the water and separate them so that they aren't in contact. It's some pretty clever chemical engineering that went into the development of those things.
John's wondering, does the ACF50 or Corrosion X make any difference for aircraft stored in unheated or heated hangars? And how about on airports where anti-ice is habitually applied to taxiways and runways? Is that an issue?
Oh, yes, it's definitely an issue, and those corrosion preventive compounds are a good idea for all metal airplanes. They just need to be applied more often if the airplane is stored outdoors than if this airplane is stored inside. But it's a really good idea to treat airplane with that stuff, and I have treated my airplane a number of times with that stuff over the years.
Just a comment from Lyman. He said that, fabric covered airplanes, tailwheel airplanes, typically with the tail pointed down, it's important to check the drain holes on the lower portion for those steel tube fuselages to make sure they're not plugged.
Yeah, that's not just true of tail draggers either. That's true of everything. I mean, a really good example, for instance, Beach Bonanzas and Barons and King Airs, the bolts that hold the wings on are accessible through there's something called a bathtub fitting that they screw into in the wing, and the bathtub fitting is called a bathtub fitting because it's got an opening that looks roughly like a bathtub, and they have a drain hole in the bottom of them, so that if any water gets into the bathtub fitting, it will leave through the drain hole. And one of the problems that you see fairly often in the Bonanza community is that the drain holes in the bathtub fittings will get clogged with some sort of debris, and the bathtub fittings will then fill up with water and start rusting out the bolts that hold the wings on. Pretty scary. And we've seen some just horrible corrosion in those very highly critical structural areas. Doesn't get much more serious than the bolts that hold the wings on, simply due to the fact that the drain holes got obstructed and nobody was checking them and making sure that they were clear. That's something that has to be done at every annual, is to check and make sure those drain holes are open and draining. So drain holes are real important on any kind of a metal airplane, or any airplane that has surfaces that can corrode, not just tail draggers.
Stephen just comments, I use an external cover to prevent rain from seeping into door, vent, and window vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, external covers, I said on the slide, it was a mixed blessing, they're very helpful in some regards, but they also have the potential for actually damaging, particularly the plexiglass. If abrasive stuff gets under the cover, for example, in a wind and so on. So there are probably times, if you do use external covers, there are probably times that you ought to take them off as a defensive measure, particularly if it's dry and windy and there's blowing dust and stuff. That's when we see the most problems with external covers.
Frank wonders, would you choose a community hangar over a tie down always, or does the risk of hangar rash outweigh the benefits?
Personally, I would choose the community hangar over the tie down every time. I'd obviously much rather have my own hangar, which I finally do, but I think a community hangar is well worthwhile if that's all that's available.
Dale wonders, did you ever consider using prop lock, avionics locks, or throttle locks when your plane was parked outside?
I didn't. For the 3 weeks at Santa Maria Airport, there are places. I mean, if my airplane was parked outdoors in a big city airport, I would be much more inclined to do that. I just have been at Santa Maria Airport for a long time, and I know the vandalism rate is pretty low there. Whereas up in the Bay Area or down in the Los Angeles area, there tend to be much more issues of vandalism of airplanes that are tied down outdoors.
Gary's wondering, hangars with or without electric, if there's an option, is the extra expense worth it? Portable generator in lieu of hangars with electric, maybe?
Well, again, I guess that's a situational thing. I mean, it kind of depends on it. Do you have the choice? If you have the choice of a hangar that has electricity in it, I'd certainly won't want to opt for that for all kinds of reasons, lighting, and so on. There are probably places where there just aren't hangars with electrical service available. In which case, then you need to improvise. I wish my hangar had running water in it. It doesn't, but it does have electricity, fortunately. But when I think about all the things that run off electricity in my hangar, I mean, first of all, the lighting is very important. The ability to run my air compressor, to run my power tools, shop lights. It's not something that I deal with, but if it was a cold climate, you need some place to plug in your engine preheaters and so on. So having electricity is certainly one of the great advantages of hangaring. And I haven't personally run into a situation with hangars that didn't have electric service, but I guess that must exist, in which case, you have to do what you have to do. But, a generator might be workable for when you're maintaining the airplane, but it certainly isn't workable for a preheater where you need to leave it on all night or something.
Yeah, Derek says loading and unloading after dark is a huge benefit. Assumably he has lights in his hangar, so that's a huge benefit for him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Walt's wondering, is a heated or unheated hangar better for aircraft longevity?
Well, a heated hangar is certainly better. Where I live, there are no such things as heated hangars because it doesn't get cold enough to warrant it. In cold weather, obviously, a heated hangar is a tremendous benefit. And when I'm flying to the cold country, I pay a fair amount of money to put my airplane in a heated hangar overnight prior to departure. If it's real cold out, if we're talking about Minnesota or Wisconsin or something, I can't even imagine how you'd work on an airplane in an unheated hangar. It would be really difficult. Kind of hard to work on an airplane when you're wearing a snowsuit.
It's no fun, believe me.
Yeah, no, I imagine not.
And that's why you keep your car handy to go into the car and warm up every 30 minutes or so. Or we got these things called torpedo heaters that run.
Don't ask you how you know this, right?
Yeah, right. Hey, so cold weather here. A number of people are asking about, the planes that are outfitted with an engine heater, like a Tannis, Reef, or something like that. Benefits, minuses of using that, and what about leaving it plugged in throughout the entire winter?
Right, that's a question that comes up a lot. First of all, having an electric preheater is very beneficial. However, it turns out, the question about whether to leave it plugged in all the time is an interesting one. Tannis did a pretty interesting study on this years ago. And what they found was the following. If the if the engines are connected to an air dehydrator, to one of these engine saver kinds of things, Black Max or whatever, that fill the engine full of pre-dried air, and keep moisture out of the engine, then it's okay to leave the heater on all the time. On the other hand, if the engine is not connected to a dehydrator, then leaving the heater on all the time can be problematic, because what it winds up doing is it winds up having the heat on will vaporize the moisture that's in the oil sump. And that moisture then starts drifting around inside the engine in the form of water vapor until it finds something cold to condense on. And the electric heaters don't heat everything. And there's always some cold thing in the engine. In Continental engines, for example, I know that the coldest thing in that engine is typically the starter adapter. There's a very expensive part called the starter adapter shaft gear, and it doesn't get any heat from an electric heater. And so what happens is that moisture gets evaporated by the heater, which is heating up the oil pan and so on. And then that moisture winds up condensing back on the starter adapter shaft gear, and after a while, the starter adapter shaft gear just becomes a massive rust. So if you want to keep a heater on all the time, you have to make sure that it heats everything and it doesn't leave cold spots in the engines. So for example, if you used an electric heater like a Tannis or a Reef, and you put one of those quilted engine covers on over the engine and some cowl plugs in, then the entire inside of the engine compartment would be heated up, and the engine would be acting as if it was in a heated hangar, and that would be fine. But unless you take a precaution like that, you run the risk of creating a corrosion problem somewhere in the engine on some expensive component that isn't getting preheated by the preheater. So that was kind of an interesting study that they did. The engine dehydrators are a really great idea if you're in an area of high corrosion risk, because they're basically a little bitty air pump, kind of like an aquarium pump that pump a very small volume of air through a desiccant chamber that dries out the air and absorbs all the moisture. And then that dried out air gets plumbed into the crankcase and fills the engine with a slight positive pressure of pre-dehydrated air and forces the moisture, any moisture that's in the engine, out. Of course, there's always a lot of moisture in the engine whenever it comes in from a flight, because the combustion process generates copious quantities of steam, and most of it goes out the exhaust pipe, but a fair amount of it gets by the rings and gets into the crankcase. And so there's always tons of moisture in the engine every time it comes in from a flight. If you hook one of these dehydrators to the engine, most of them use desiccant crystals. There's one that actually uses a refrigeration unit to dehydrate the air, but the basic effect is that dehydrated air is being pumped inside the engine and forces all the moisture out. And that's a really good way to prevent internal corrosion to the engine. But if you're using a dehydrator, then you can leave the heater on all the time, because there isn't any moisture that's going to do any damage. But if you're not, then you have to be careful about leaving the heater on all the time, unless the engine is cocooned somehow to make sure that heat is getting everywhere.
Cool. So is that the answer to John's question, which was, do you recommend an engine saver like the Black Max?
Absolutely, yeah. There are a variety of those things. The engine dehydrators, or they go by different names, but they all basically do the same thing, and they're very effective. They're particularly valuable for aircraft that are based in areas of high corrosion risk, down on the Gulf Coast, Florida, that sort of thing.
Mark's got an interesting comment here. He says, I put a box fan on the floor of my hangar hooked up to a humidity lever switch. Helped immensely in a tin hangar during humid conditions.
I don't even know what a humidity lever switch is.
Apparently when it gets humid, this fan kicks on and the fan moves the air, and he says that's helping.
I have heard from some people who have bought electric dehydrators. There are room dehydrators that you can buy for a few $100s that plug into the into a wall socket and absorb moisture from the air and deposit it into a tank. And he's done some relative humidity studies inside his hangar and says that the thing works very well. I've never tried anything like that.
Christopher's wondering, what would you say is the average price to hangar an airplane?
Oh, there is no such thing. It varies so dramatically. For just, to give you a data point, my 60 by 40 clear span hangar, which is a gigantic hangar, is I pay a little less than $700 a month for it. When I first got the hangar 20 years ago, it was $4 something a month. Now it's up in the high 600s per month. And that's considered an exceptionally good deal in California. If I was at an airport in Southern California or in the Bay Area, the hangar rent would be at least twice that much. T hangars are proportionately less expensive because they have about half the volume of what's in my hangar, and a lot of T hangars at Santa Maria Airport. I don't know what the current rate on them is, but I know it's a lot less than what I'm paying for the clear span.
Mm-hmm. Den is wondering, what about chains versus ropes for tie down outside?
That's not exactly my area of expertise. I know with ropes, you have to be fairly careful about the how you tie the knots. There've been a lot of accidents with airplanes that were tied down where the knots weren't tied right. I think you need to go through sailor school or something to learn how to do all that correctly. But I don't really know the pros and cons of ropes versus chains. I just use whatever's available because.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of straps. Got cargo straps
those
being
are
used
becoming
nowadays.
a lot more popular. These nylon straps, and they're very convenient, and they're probably more impervious to environmental degradation than ropes are.
Yep, probably a lot stronger, and you don't have the knots issue. Dennis is wondering, is it okay to use a damp rid inside the cockpit to reduce and or prevent any moisture getting into your avionics?
Is it okay to use what inside the cockpit?
Damp rid, he said.
I don't know what that is. Sounds like it might be a desiccant or something. I'm just not familiar with it.
Desiccant would be okay in there, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if it's contained. And of course, it doesn't last. Desiccants don't last forever. They typically turn color to tell you that they've absorbed all the moisture that they can, and then you either put new in or you take the stuff home and you stick it in the oven and get rid of the moisture. Then you can reuse it.
Yeah. Okay, we had people. Mark says bowline knots we should use, and Brian says straps with hooks are a problem as they can release, which is a good point if it's just an S hook on there. If it does come loose, that could come right off. A number of comments from everybody. Everything from LPS-1 works great to kill bees, apparently.
Really?
So, yep, we got that suggestion in there. And it doesn't hurt your
is the silicone spray. LPS-1 is the light stuff, huh?
And
I wouldn't be as gutsy to spray one on a bee, to tell you the truth. I'd rather use Raid. So my nose gets chilled.
Yeah, and glue traps work great for mice around your tires. If you put glue traps around your tires, somebody said.
Good idea.
Yeah, and let's see here. Any special things to be considering if you're storing outside in a very hot environment? Paul is wondering.
Well, yeah, I actually learned to fly in Phoenix and had a little bit experience in hot environments when I was there. And generally, those are good because the hottest places like that tend to be hot and dry, and the dry is a good thing. But things like reflective window covers are like super important. And when we were in Phoenix, we would always put up window covers every time we parked the airplane anywhere, even for a fairly short period of time, because it could just get unspeakably hot inside if we didn't do that. Oh, you know, the other, has probably nothing to do with it, but the other thing about storing airplanes in hot weather is that battery, the self-discharge rate of batteries increases exponentially with hot weather. And so if it's really hot out, it's a really good idea to keep the battery on a trickle charger, which may not be so easy if you're on a tie down, you don't have access to electricity. But batteries tend to lose their charge a lot faster in hot weather. And that was a pretty big problem when we were in Phoenix.
Well, let's see. We have a lot of comments and a lot of good suggestions from people, about, as we talked about, trying to keep the mice out. Tie downs, yeah. So Gerald's wondering about the tie downs. He says, remind people not to use the doggy style tie downs like people use at Oshkosh because they're not very strong. I guess that's that corkscrew style tie down if you're tying down out in the grass. That's a question. Walt was wondering, would it be better to tie down on pavement or on grass?
Well, I would think it would be better to tie down on pavement. You know, Tim, you're talking about those screw-in anchors. There are a number of anchors available now that consist of like 3 stakes that you drive in at 3 different angles. You know what I'm talking about?
Sure, yeah.
And those things I think are pretty strong. The screw-in anchors are the strength of the screw-in anchors depends pretty radically on what you're screwing them into. And if you're screwing them into mud or something, they're not going to be very effective. But I think those ones where you drive in the 3 long studs at 3 different angles so that the thing has a pretty broad spread underground. Those things I think are relatively strong.
Sure. Paul's wondering, how bad is it to have a chipped or flaking, flaking paint either inside or outside if you're either in a hangar or out of a hangar?
Well, of course, the paint is the barrier that protects you from corrosion. So if you see an area where paint's chipped off, which I periodically do on my airplane, it's a really good idea to treat it as quickly as you notice it, and put some primer on there, and then put some touch-up paint on there just to keep the barrier.
Is that a preventive maintenance thing? An owner?
Absolutely.
Oh,
yeah. Painting is one of the things that's on the preventive maintenance list. And if you want to paint a whole airplane with, buy 100 cans of Krylon at Home Depot and paint the whole airplane, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's perfectly legal to do that. The only gotcha about painting is that if you paint control surfaces, then they have to be rebalanced, and rebalancing the control surface is not a preventive maintenance item, but the painting is.
Darren's wondering, is cam guard a good idea?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm a big believer in cam guard.
Whether it be tied down outside or hangared aircraft? Matter?
Again, the cam guard's claim to fame is it's a very, very good corrosion inhibitor. And so it's even more important if you're tied down than if you're hangared. I'm hangared and I always use cam guard, but it's even more important if the airplane's stored outside.
And we had a question here. What about for long-term storage? What should be done to prevent corrosion in the engine?
Long-term storage, I mean, non-flying storage, where the airplane's going to be down for. Normally, the rule of thumb is that if the airplane's going to be down for more than a month or so, the engine should be preserved, or colloquially called pickled. And there's a procedure for that. Both Lycoming and Continental have service bulletins on how to do it. And basically, it consists of draining the oil and putting in a special corrosion preventative oil, running the engine to make sure that the corrosion preventative oil is well distributed, and then removing the top spark plugs from each cylinder, putting in a plastic desiccant plug instead to absorb any moisture to keep the inside of the cylinders dry, and taking bags of desiccant and shoving them into the induction air intake and into the exhaust pipes to absorb any moisture that's in the intake and exhaust plumbing of the engine. And an engine that's preserved that way. And actually, if you go to Aircraft Spruce, you can buy a kit. I forget if it's Tanis or who, but they offer a kit with all of the stuff in it, the preventative oil and desiccant plugs and the desiccant bags and stuff. But you can buy an engine preservative kit that has all of the stuff, and everything involved in doing that is preventive maintenance. So an owner can do it themselves if they want to. It's just kind of a highly specialized oil change, if you will.
Cool. A comment from John, which makes a lot of sense to me. He says, I'm a longtime airplane watcher. Chains can never be tight. So in gusty winds, there's a lot of very abrupt, jerky stops as the wing or tail hits the end of the chain. Ropes have some give, and both ropes and straps can be cinched down tightly.
Yeah, good comment. I agree with that.
Any idea? John is wondering about any input on Bow Shield T9 for corrosion protection. I think it's a Boeing product.
Yeah, Bow Shield T9. Well, it was a Boeing product. I think Boeing sold it, and I think it's another company that makes it now. But it was originated by Boeing, and it's an older technology product than ACF 50 or Corrosion X. It's more of a barrier kind of a product. I think it's a little more similar to LPS 3 and it's in the way it works. And it's reasonably good stuff. I personally prefer the thin film dielectric stuff because it gets everywhere. It's applied as a fog that just drifts and gets to all sorts of inaccessible places in the airplane. And it's the thin film dielectrics will stop an active corrosion cell, whereas the sealant types will not. They'll just kind of seal it in, but they won't stop the corrosion cell that's already in progress. But the thin film dielectrics will do that. So those are the ones that I personally prefer. But any of these corrosion preventative compounds are better than not using them, that's for sure.
Neil's wondering about the reflective window covers that we put inside the plane, and then the space that creates between the window and that cover. Is that trapping extra heat, which could contribute to plexiglass crazings? Plexiglass really heating up, extra heat trapped in between that space.
Well, I don't think so. The covers are reflective, so that they don't. The covers themselves don't really heat up, and if the covers don't heat up, I can't really see what would heat up the air in that small gap. I know when even in a hot place like Phoenix or Las Vegas or something, when you take down the covers in preparation for going flying, the covers themselves are not particularly warm to the touch. They just don't retain heat because they're reflective. So my guess is that's not a problem.
Kevin's wondering, can you use cam guard on a Continental engine even if using a Shell 80 or 100 plus?
You can, but it's kind of a waste of money. If you're going to use the cam guard, then there's really no particular reason to use the 80 or 100 plus. You can just use the 80 or 100 non-plus and save some money. The cam guard itself is relatively expensive, but there's not really an advantage of using the plus formulation oil and cam guard. That's kind of overkill. So I use, and have for many years, used W100 with cam guard, and it seems to be very, very effective.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mike. Well, a lot of great comments and suggestions from people, but that kind of sums up the questions here. So please take a moment and share closing thoughts with everyone.
That was my intention, was to get a discussion going. It sounds like it worked.
Yeah, that was real good.
Okay, well, not much to say, just the usual. You can sign up for my monthly email newsletter at the website, savvyaviation.com, or on the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to ask you to fill out. I'm in the final stages of my Aircraft Ownership Volume 2 book. We're down to 3 chapters out of 55, so I think we're going to make it by the end of the year. Working really hard on that. The first 3 books are available now on Amazon, and the 4th book should be available just after the first of the year. Hopefully, it's looking like we're going to be pretty good on that on that target date. And just my next 3 webinars. January webinar, we're going to be talking about AOG situations where an airplane breaks down on the road. And then February and March are going to be a series of 2 webinars discussing some of the technical aspects of bolted joints. The February webinar will talk about bolted joints where the bolts are in tension. And in March, we'll talk about bolted joints when the bolts are in shear, which pretty much covers the 2 common cases. So that'll be for the geeks in the audience, but it's pretty interesting stuff. And that's all I've got, Tim.
Fantastic, Mike. A lot of great comments from everybody. Thanks a lot from Kevin, and great job from Merrick, and nice job from Richard. So a lot of nice comments, Mike. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to those geek presentations in February and March. So send me the descriptions on those when you can, so we can get them in the schedule and people can pre-register for them.
I will do
Fantastic. That. Yep. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Hey, thanks, everybody. See you next month.